Esto es Contraélite.
Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos los podescuchas de Contraélite. Estamos aquí de nuevo, renovados y rejuvenecidos después de una breve pausa aquí en Contraélite. Yo soy Vanessa y tenemos aquí también a Jorge y a una invitada especial a quien vamos a
Hola,
entrevistar en inglés.
Hola Vanessa, sí, estamos muy contentos sobre nuestra invitada de hoy, pero también estoy muy fascinado de que estamos reformateando, transformando la dinámica del programa y diversificando un poco los temas, porque siempre hablar de política o estar siempre hablando sobre ciertos países también puede ser un poco tedioso, entonces vamos a dar un giro de 180 grados y diversificarnos un poco para hablar de temas también de actualidad culturales, complejos y creo que generan polémica y eso siempre es bueno.
Perfecto. All right, so we will start in English now. The rest of our podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all Contra Elite podcast listeners. We are here today. I'm really excited because we are back from a brief hiatus, and we are refreshed and renewed, and we're going to be tackling different topics and broadening, diversifying kind of our themes. And so I'm Vanessa, and we're here with Jorge, and also as special guest, which we'll introduce later. Jorge, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. So yeah, very happy about joining you today, and it's just really excited to start this new season, this new format, and this new dynamic in our podcast. Like you said, diversifying and broadening our perspective and topics. So yeah, go ahead, take it away with the introduction, Vanessa.
Okay, so I am really excited about the topic and about our guest today. We have Dr. Lynn Comella, who is Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies and Chair of the Department of Interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her research explores the cultural and economic organization of the adult entertainment industry, including the ways that feminist entrepreneurs have disrupted ideas of business as usual within a historically male-dominated realm. She is the author of various books, publications, co-editor. She's the former co-chair of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Adult Film History Scholarly Interest Group and current member of the editorial advisory boards for the Routledge Journal Porn Studies and the University of Edinburgh's Screening Sex book series. I mean, we have, boom, an expert here, and I am so excited. Welcome, 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 Lynn.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me and creating this space for this conversation today.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so Jorge came across an article that you had written a while ago, I over 10 years ago, called "Feminist Gone Wild: a response to porn critic Gail Dines." And maybe people aren't too familiar, and it's interesting that he he told me about this article, and I guess, like, full disclosure, I'm a porn skeptic at this point, and so I do use and consume porn, but I think I have questions. I have questions, and so yeah. So when you have questions, you do encounter sometimes the rantings or the solid arguments of sociologist Gail Dines, and she is the author of Pornland: How Porn Hijacked Our Sexuality, and I think would likely identify as someone who is a feminist, but like an anti-porn feminist. And so Dr. Comella.
If I can interrupt real quick.
Yes.
And of course, we're going to leave the article in the description so all of our listeners can read it. And I highly recommend them to read them because it's very enlightening writing. But if you could, before we discuss the article and then Lynn's updated take, I think, what she's writing an article in response to Gail Dines. So how would you summarize briefly Gail Dines' perspective regarding porn?
How would I summarize it, or?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, you, Vanessa.
Oh, okay. Well,
real quick,
yeah. From what I've read, and man, I haven't gone too deeply into this, but yeah, she believes that porn is violent and it's bad and it's disempowering and basically a bane to the existence of feminism and feminists, and it's misogynistic, and basically, like, in a nutshell, that's what I have gleaned from her writing. So yeah, that's the premise that she has put forth.
And if I'm going to put the same question to me, how would I summarize Lynn Comella's article? She's writing in a very scientific way, responding to her.
I think, first of all, if we're going to talk about pornography, I bet many of your viewers aren't actually sure what we're talking about. Because many people tend to have an image of porn, of kind of Playboy 10, 15 years ago, of a naked woman, you know, bending over coyly, smiling in a cornfield.
So what are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about mainstream porn on the internet, the sort of pornography you get if you type porn into Google, which you are now looking at body-punishing, cruel sex, women being gagged with penises, women being roughly penetrated by 3, 4 men, as they're calling her the most awful names and spitting in her face and slapping her and just doing all sorts of really violent, aggressive, demeaning things to her. Now, that's the kind of porn that I talk about in Pornland, because that is mainstream. And when you have advocates from the porn industry like Ron Jeremy, what they want to say is that this is just marginalised and the worst. And they know as well as I do that the main type of profitable pornography today in the industry is body-punishing, hardcore pornography.
Ron?
That has seeped into our culture. Okay, there's a new study out. There's a new study out that actually compares the pornography produced by women versus the pornography produced by men. It's just been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and what they find is pornography produced by women is actually slightly more violent and demeaning than that produced by men. So that has absolutely cuts no cloth. Also, the vast majority of consumers today are still men. I think less than 20% of consumers, they reckon, of pornography is women, and that's not the hardcore pornography that they're consuming.
And for me, the thing that captivated me the most about her article is that, well, I don't know what kind of porn she's watching, or I don't know what kind of people she's hanging out with, but that's certainly not my experience. That's certainly not my colleagues or friends or work experience. And she really goes deep in counteracting and counter-arguing porn critic Gail Dines. So in a way that she does it, I think it's a very interesting analysis and evaluation about what's factual, what's not, how it's evolving, how it needs to be reformed, and kind of lowering the volume of hysteria from Gail Dines' argument. Am I reading too much into it? Am I just crazy in this analysis? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love this description about lowering the volume of hysteria. That's such like a great evocative description. And I think some context might be helpful for people who are listening to this thinking, whoa, why am I plopped all of a sudden down into the middle of feminist debates about pornography? And what are these debates? And how long have they been going on? So they've been going on a long time. Like, there's been feminist debates about pornography, you know, certainly since the kind of emergence in a visible way of the adult industry in the early 1970s, right? So if you think about 1972 was when the film Deep Throat was released. And that was a cultural phenomena, right? It was back in the day where if you wanted to see a quote unquote dirty movie, you were going to a place like Times Square, you were going to a designated adult theater, and you were sitting in a theater surrounded by other people who were watching the same movie. It was an era before VHS and DVD, certainly long before something called internet porn existed. So these debates really go back to the early 1970s. By the end of the 1970s, there was a lot of organizing that certain feminists were doing around media violence that included pornography. And then by the early 1980s, the issue for many feminists was the ways in which pornography really was an example, not just of the worst of patriarchal society, right? That it was misogynistic, that pornography was inherently violent, inherently dangerous, inherently harmful, especially to women, children, and relationships. So that's a bit of the long picture, but this article that you stumbled upon from 2011, from my past, that was a rare example for me as an academic of going toe to toe with a person in print. It's not something I do that much, but at the time, I was writing a monthly column for Las Vegas Weekly, and the column was about sexuality and culture. So everything from, local dominatrixes to, kind of talking about the history of erotic writing and all sorts of things like that. So every month I would write about something different that was timely. And this particular month, I decided to use my column inches in print, my 1,000 words that I had each month, to really directly respond to a piece that Gail Dines had written in The Guardian, I think it was. And it was kind of a screed, an anti-pornography screed published in The Guardian just before the 2011 AVN Adult Entertainment Expo, which is this annual big adult entertainment trade show, essentially, that takes place in Las Vegas. So I was really struck by and taken aback by what I read, because she was using, the upcoming adult entertainment expo as an opportunity to once again kind of regurgitate or argue her position on pornography. And she, was talking about all the predatory capitalists that would be in attendance. And oh, by the way, this year they're going to have a session called In the Company of Women. And at this session, feminists, pornographers, and academics are going to be hobnobbing, but it's really just a trick. It's really just a trick by these predatory capitalists to make you think that porn has any social value, including for women. And I read this article, I'm like, wait a second.
Yeah, it's like, they're porn apologists.
I organized that session. I organized that session. I put it together. I know exactly what that session is about. And your take is flawed. Your take is wrong. So I was responding to a couple things. I was kind of responding quite directly to what I perceived as a deliberate mischaracterization, not accidental, but quite deliberate. Kind of, this smoke and mirrors, pretending that one thing is another thing in a way that suits her argument. So there was that piece, but I was also responding as, a Las Vegas resident. I moved here in 2007, so I'm coming up on, I've been here 17 years, that there's a real tendency for people to do parachute journalism. They'll just drop themselves into Las Vegas, drop themselves into something that's happening in Las Vegas, spend a day or two here, and then pass off their, 24-hour ethnography as some deep dive into some phenomena. It happens all the time, and it's a real source of consternation for those of us who live here, who are academics or not. You could just be an artist, or you can be a lawyer, or you can be a writer and still be like, oh gosh, another one of these large exposés that kinds of miss the mark. So yeah, I thought it was an intentional mischaracterization. I thought that it was a form of parachute journalism that was really thin. And I also thought it was a marketing opportunity, because this was early 2011 and Gail Dines' book, Pornland, had just come out in 2010, right? So it was an opportunity for her to reproduce the central argument or thesis in her book in a popular media forum, The Guardian, but then to do all of this kind of abracadabra, one thing is not like the other, kind of smoke and mirrors. And I was like, wow, that is, it makes for a really compelling read. And if I knew nothing about the porn industry and that was the only thing I read, I'd be shook. I'd be like, wow, this is horrible. But
we must rescue women from porn and just immoral. But it's just so interesting that you mentioned about parachute journalism. We're very familiar with that, being from Venezuela, because I feel a lot of Western journalists do that when talking about Venezuelan politics. They just go there one week and they want to explain to us how politics are, and it just really. I thought we were like a special case, but after listening to you, it happens also in Las Vegas and in other places.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
but just real quick, just playing the devil's advocate a little bit, it's very interesting, and you really know your topic, and you really took the time to dissect her bad faith arguments, which I think that they are. But don't you think a person like her would say, but you are cherry picking studies, you are being a porn apologist, you are apologizing for the patriarchy and violence? What would you say to that?
Well, I think it would be hard for her to make that case because she wasn't there. So she doesn't know anything about like that particular panel. All she knows is a little description in the program, right? So, I think, one thing I would say is you're calling me a porn apologist based on what? Based on a description in a program for an event and a seminar you didn't attend because you weren't at the expo and you weren't even in the city, right? So I think I would kind of counter with, how are you reaching that conclusion? And I think that, how do I want to say this? I think that anybody who studies popular culture or just who studies politics, right? That popular culture is full of contradictions. And part of being a good researcher, I think, is to be able to tease out and analyze and understand contradictions. So me as a researcher and as somebody who has been very interested in women's involvement in the adult entertainment industry, especially those who define themselves as feminists or queer identified women, I'm very interested in kind of how did they disrupt kind of this industry that really historically was designed by men for men. If you look at like the early history of porn, if you look at the early history even of adult stores, like these were not spaces that catered to women, right? So in what ways did women try to come in and say, I'm not really a fan of what we have now, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, if we're talking in the early 70s about how liberating vibrators can be for women, but women don't want to go into traditional adult stores to buy them, can we create a different kind of sex toy store for a different, more diverse audience that could just recreate the idea of a sex toy store or recreate the idea of porn? So I'm very interested in just the shifts in the industry. And so apologizing for what? Like, what would I be apologizing for? I'm apologizing for the existence of an industry that predates my birth. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't create the industry. I'm not saying that, there's not kind of, sexism or racism or queer phobia in porn, but I'm also not saying there aren't those same things in Hollywood or in the music industry, right? And so, I think it is worth saying, why does one industry kind of stand out amongst all these other kinds of industries? And what's that about? That this becomes politicized at different moments in time in different ways, right?
Just real quick, and last question about this, and then Vanessa will ask you something. I mean, but at the same time, aren't you with your science and your fancy science and your amazing argument just trying to kind of diminish the God-fearing, puritanical, I don't know, pilgrim point of view of most Americans? And you're this liberal professor, woke, who is just wants to promote the degradation of females and just kind of sexualizing everything about women and objectifying them?
I'm not sure how I do that. How do I sexualize women just by studying something that already exists, right? So basically, if that's the argument, so if I study it, I'm sexualizing women. But what if I'm not studying it? Does that mean the women aren't sexualized? Does that mean like their argument falls apart if Lynn Comella is not studying it? So I don't know if that's a really convincing of argument. I think that, yeah, I just happen to study one of the more controversial segments of popular culture, but at the same time that it's controversial, it's also extremely popular, right? We could argue that it's probably one of the most popular segments of popular culture.
Absolutely.
It's hard to pin down how many billions of dollars the adult industry and pornography specifically makes globally, because these are not publicly traded entities. So we can't kind of track the profits in a way that we would be able to. So a lot of the figures that get bandied around are kind of made up figures, right? So yeah, I just, my kind of intellectual curiosity as a graduate student just kind of, made me start looking at the history of feminist sex toy stores. I mean, my entry point to kind of pornography was through studying the history of feminist sex toy stores. And the kind of place in pornography, which was uneven, within the history of these businesses, some of which didn't carry porn at all, some of which took them a decade to even consider maybe, curating some kind of porn collection. But I because I was studying feminist sex toy stores, I first began to look at, the history of, quote unquote, feminist pornography and queer pornography, right? So I had a very kind of alternative entry point as well, in terms of just thinking about the production of feminist pornography, what it was trying to do that was quote unquote different than mainstream pornographers. So
that's definitely a different something that makes me think about like now that you're talking about like feminist sex toy stores, and like one of the first sex toy stores that I went to was in Oregon, in Portland, which I don't know. I don't have a lot of love for Portland. They were not very nice there. I do have a lot of love for Seattle, and for Los Angeles and for Las Vegas. I actually love Las Vegas. And living in Iowa, I'm like, how does Des Moines exist in the same country as Las Vegas and as Los Angeles? Like that is insane. And Des Moines is the more liberal or like liberated city here in Iowa. Maybe Iowa City would contend us to that. But it's interesting that you do talk about like those spaces, because there is, I don't know, and maybe this is because, I come from a Latin American country, kind of, Catholic, is just conservative. And then now I live in the Midwest, and I have spent a really long time in the Midwest, South Dakota and Iowa specifically, which are like, I don't know, the corn Bible Belt. So we, the perception of sexuality, especially when it comes to women, it's very like, there's like a lot of shame attached to it. And historically there has been, and like, you have to keep your legs together and you don't have to, it's like, it's all on you. It's all your responsibility. sexuality. And it's almost like it's very and I remember a quote from from Sex and the City, which is a show that even though it might have aged not too well, I really have a lot of love for it. And so I think Miranda was talking about that like sexuality in New York was very like bottom shelf paper bag, whereas like in the West Coast it was very like open and like, hi, I have sex. And so here it's very much, and I think in Venezuela to an extent it's very much like bottom shelf paper bag, like very hidden, especially female sexuality, or sexuality of women. It's like, are you really you're gonna buy a toy? Like, what is that? Like, you're supposed to just kind of like lay there and take it. And so that's what you see, and that's what you saw in a lot of like mainstream porn, with some variations. And so, I guess like that's where my point of view has been. And I have, in my use of pornography, I have encountered some performers that are different in that sense, and that do different practices. But I hear that you're saying there has been some evolution and some openness, and like I agree that like as far as like sex toy stores in other spaces are more open and welcoming of women, and it's not shameful, and we've kind of like gained back our agency over our sexuality, and we've like this popularized of this concept of like slut shaming and how that's bad and how we shouldn't be doing that, and we shouldn't feel ashamed to have sex and to want sex and to be active in knowing what we want and what we need. Yet at the same time, you look at something like, I don't know, Pornhub, which is like one of the most well-known, at least here in the US, where people go and seek that out. And it's a lot of kind of like it. When I was reading what Gail Dines was saying, it's like it is kind of violent. It is a lot of like choking and like, you fucking bitch and you slut, and like very like and like people gargling on members, and it's like, oh my God. And then you see a study such as like, it's like a recent study that came out saying that like, I don't know, a very significant number, I believe it's like 58% or something, of like young people are reporting that they were choked during sex, that they're like routinely being choked. And then I think about like a lot of the behaviors that like I myself have even performed.
Of performative sexuality for men and them trying to sell us, products.
If I have to hear that fucking word empowerment again, I think I'm going to have to throw a feminist fit, honestly.
I agree. I
am so sick of this.
We roast that all the time, yeah.
First of all, let me say this, the porn industry has a very well-oiled PR machine. When some guy is trying to groom you into porn, he's getting this from the porn industry, right? He's not thinking this up himself, by the way. He's being fed how to groom women and girls into porn. And what will you explain to me what is empowering about going onto a porn set, being anally, vaginally, orally pounded away, being called a slut, a whore, a cum dunster, and a cunt, being ejaculated in the face, especially in the eyes, maybe getting, if you're lucky, a small amount of money, that image then going up onto Pornhub, the women never seeing a penny of it, and men all over the world jerking off to what was probably one of the worst experiences of your life. Can somebody please explain to me how that's empowerment? And what's interesting, we never talk about male empowerment. We talk about male power. And when men have power, that means they have economic power, legal power, social power. For women, our power lies in, full bikini waxes, fucking any man that wants us to fuck him, giving blowjobs. Why do they get the real material power and ours becomes a pseudo empowerment through becoming disposable sex objects for men? If we want power, we want the same type of power that men have, which is economic, social, and legal power, so that women no longer have to live as a subordinate sex class.
That it's kind of something that's mimicking from what I've seen in porn. And it's like, do we really need to make so much noise? And just kind of like being in your head, it's like, how do I look? How does my face look? And then the slapping and the pulling of the hair and things like that. And so I'm just like, okay. And I choose to watch performers that maybe are different. I'm gonna shout out, I don't know. I like Owen Gray. I think he's great. I think he's like an example of like something that's sexy and like edgy and cool and inclusive. But I don't think that that's not really I don't know if that's the norm. And I don't know when I see a study such as people are getting choked on the regular, whether they want it or not, then I'm like, okay, was Gail Dines right? Like, what's going on? And what do you think as far as like the piece of the pie of the like what has that evolution been? And what do you see where it's going? And do you think this is a very like a multi-pronged question. What's the evolution that you have seen? And do you believe that pornography is affecting real behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there to respond to. I mean, I want to return to something that you touched upon just a few minutes ago, was this question of sexual agency and kind of maybe how feminist sex toy stores or even feminist pornography can kind of invite people to maybe step into their sexual agency in a way that maybe they hadn't been given permission previously. But I don't think that that's like one and done, right? I think people are always, I think kind of especially for women, for queer people, for, women and queer people of color, right? Like there's just this kind of, sexual agency, it's ongoing work, right? To claim your sexual agency, to feel like you have permission to explore your desires in safe, consensual ways with other adults, all of that kind of stuff. So I think the sexual agency piece, it's not like a baton, right? It's not like a relay race where someone passes you the baton of sexual agency, you grab it and, like it's sexual agency, really stepping into that. It's ongoing work in a culture, especially for women and queer folks. You're kind of told that your desires, your bodily integrity, your pleasures are not worthy, right? That there's a sexual class citizen, that you're sexual objects, that you're not sexual subjects. So I think that battle is still ongoing, right? And I even see it in young people, my students, where, that they're still trying to make their way in a culture with so many competing, conflicting ideas about who they are and who they should be, especially when it comes to sex, right? And they're trying to navigate that, especially in the US context, in a world with abysmal sex education, right? And so, there is this kind of question that has been posed by a number of people, like, what is the work that pornography is doing to stand in for the sexual education that's so lacking, right? So there's that. And then there's your question, which is a question that gets posed a lot. What kind of impact, right? What kind of effect does pornography have on people's sense of themselves, on their sexual practices, on their relationships? And that's a huge question. It's just really hard to study media effects well, whether you're looking at the effects of violent video games or violent lyrics and music. I mean, the whole effects question. And I think that, that there is this kind of question, what impact is it that porn impacts people's sexual practices, or that kind of people's sexual practices shape pornography? And it's clearly a little bit of both. And the example that I like to give is, in the late 1990s, there was a film that was produced called Bend Over Boyfriend. You may have heard of it, I don't know. But it's a really interesting example to think about because the film is an instructional how-to explicit sex video geared towards straight couples or bi couples in which the woman is interested in learning how to use a strap-on and literally, bend over her male partner and explore male anal play. It's affectionately known as pegging today, but this was a really groundbreaking video released in 1998. But the idea for this video was born on the sales floor of Good Vibrations in the late 1990s. Why? Because sales staff became aware that there was an uptick in the number of women and men coming in saying, I want to buy a strap-on and a dildo. What can you tell me about male anal play? And they're like, whoa, there's a phenomena happening that we haven't seen before. This might be something that we could do an instructional sex video around, kind of use this format to kind of package this information that we're getting on the sales floor every day, and we can reach a wider number of people. So it kind of became this phenomena, but the film, right, it emerged because people were clearly starting to engage with, this and ask questions about it. And then they made the film and it became Good Vibrations' top-selling film. It was like an instant classic. It was written about in not just magazines like the Cosmo, it was written about in the politically progressive magazine, The Nation. Debbie Nathan did a whole article in the 90s in the wake of the Clinton Lewinsky scandal about, I think the article was called Sodomy for the Masses, right? So you have this explicit sex video that was born on the sales floor of Good Vibrations, then circulated all over the country and the world and inspired more people to kind of then go to stores like Good Vibrations and buy these products and do this thing. So it's much more of a feedback loop, right? That's the thing. And I have to say, I have not read the study that you just referenced, Vanessa, but I'm kind of aware about it. I believe it was from my colleague at Indiana University, Debbie Herbenick, was part of this study. So I have not read the study yet, and I should. But does she? So forgive me for saying this, because this is like a kind of very problematic thing to do as a scholar, to say I haven't read it yet, but I have a thought. I'm not quite sure. I think they're pointing to a phenomena that their survey data is saying X percentage of young people are engaging in, I think it's non-consensual choking, right? Or just the activity of choking. But I'm not quite sure that they established that pornography is the causation.
Right.
But
They're not. That's not what I gleaned from it.
Okay.
And I'm by no means like an academic. Like I'm just like a member of the public reading, both articles and opinion pieces about, well, because like it seems like there's this panic or this worry that like Gen Z isn't having sex, or teenage sex is, they're not doing it, or if they're doing it, then they're getting choked, or they're doing this or all of this stuff. And I don't know. I mean, and then there's the talk about like hookup culture, which I don't know. I have many thoughts about it. But yeah, I don't think that there's like this link of like pornography is causing this. And at least in the article that I read that referenced referenced your colleagues' research, but the headline and what a lot of the public opinion is consuming is saying like a bunch of young people, a ton of them during sex are just getting choked on the regular. So, but let's go to Jorge because he has a question or a comment.
Sure.
Yes, so no, that just blew my mind about what you said about the good vibration and the strap-ons. That's fascinating. Coming back to your article towards the end, the last paragraphs, I'm just going to read a fragment. You wrote, Dines takes a slice the world of hardcore gonzo porn, which, according to her, is porn that, quote unquote, depicts hardcore body-punishing sex in which women are the mean and the base, and presented as emblematic of an entire industry. This is akin to talking about Hollywood while only referencing spaghetti western or making sweeping glosses about the music industry, when what you're really talking about is hair metal. It's an approach that makes for neither a sound argument nor good sociology. So I would like to ask you, based on your research, if you have, this information, the most updated one, what, from your perspective and from your research, what is the most average, common, most frequently viewed porn nowadays? In your opinion, is it gonzo, or that's just completely an outlier, or is it more vanilla? Just talking about the US, because in Western Europe is completely different, in Central Europe. So, but in the US, and with the advent of OnlyFans, this is a whole different category. Is that considered porn, and it's more realistic? Also, personally, I have seen from the last year a huge increase in this AI kind of porn, these deep fakes. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know kind of, the extent to which, I mean, deep fake porn is being made, but I don't have a sense yet of how available or widespread that is. I mean, I think, to answer your question, and I don't have hard data on this, but Vanessa referenced Pornhub. And so the thing about Pornhub, Pornhub and sites like it were a kind of real game changer for the adult industry, and really threw a wrench into the industry's ability to be profitable. And because a lot of the content historically on a site like Pornhub has been pirated or stolen from creators and then offered to consumers for free. So, the rise of sites like Pornhub, YouPorn, I mean, they really started to gain traction around 2008, around the global economic downturn. And that was one of a number of factors that really took an industry that had long prided itself on being recession-proof and kind of proved like, oh, we're not that recession-proof, because there are these free sites, there's pirated porn, and, we're susceptible to the same kind of economic downturns that other industries are facing. So it was kind of a wake-up moment. And a lot of porn businesses kind of downsized or completely went out of business, 2009, 2010, kind of around the time that this article came out. So I don't have data to answer your question, but I could say that I think it is the case that people are likely consuming the types of porn that they can find online that are accessible and that are free. I think that if we want to talk about ethical porn, we want to talk about the conditions under which pornography is produced, right? Are people being treated well on set, or are they being, compensated well? Do they have the ability to, dictate what kind of sexual acts they want to perform and which ones they do not, and who they want to work with. And all those things are part of the ethical production of porn. And feminists have been, a real force in saying, these are the types of things that can help produce kind of ethical production, conditions of ethical porn production. But I also think ethical porn includes consumers paying for their porn. So, you have to kind of, if folks are really committed to fair trade porn, to borrow, a phrase from Tristan Taormino, if they really care about the conditions under which people labor, if they really want to support those small indie, queer, feminist, companies, then they're going to have to kind of talk a little bit with their willingness to pay for that, whether that's a subscription to a site like Pink and White, or other opportunities that might exist. But I think a lot of people just by default, right? They kind of default to a Pornhub or to a YouPorn. And so clearly that's gonna limit what they see and what they think of porn, right? When I talk about like the history of porn, when I even mention like the history of lesbian and queer porn, my like students are like, what? Lesbian porn? That's a thing? Like lesbian porn by and for lesbians? Who knew, right? Because it's not what they see, right?
Right.
Not what they see, and that there is a lot of women directing porn as well. And I just don't know why this realization is not more widespread, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think it still remains out there in the collective imagination that porn is still like a male dominated for the male gaze, and I think that still has the repercussions, and that's why I obviously this conversation is changing my mind a bit, and reading more, because like I am a feminist, and I don't want to be one of these anti-feminist, anti-sex worker kind of individuals. I because I care about people. I care about people being treated fairly. I care about people being compensated fairly. I think that's something like, and I don't know too much of the mechanism for like something like OnlyFans, but like just for the performer to be able to kind of paywall their content and have more control, and just be able to just through their equipment and at home and say like, actually I don't want to perform for anybody, I just want to use toys or whatever, and then being able to profit from that work, that's really I think it's positive, it's empowering, but at the same time there's still this like cultural force or backlash, I believe, when you find when you hear about like the manosphere, and like you see on like X and Twitter, like you see these bots like, or people just promoting their OnlyFans, but then everybody's like, oh, now they're gonna come, like the OnlyFans girls are gonna now they're gonna starve, or they're gonna whatever because of AI, for example, or something. And so it's like, even though they found, like a lot of these performers found a way to get into a platform like where they still could have agency over what they performed and the conditions and everything, there's still like this cultural force that wants to say, but it's still disgusting, but you're still a hoe, or you're still this, or you're still in like, or it's still shameful. And so it's like, what I guess my question for that would be like, what are it seems like the progress is happening, but it's also, I don't know, what do you see as far as in the industry changing in a significant way, something disruptive like OnlyFans, but that is changing also the cultural perception of people regarding porn and porn performers, and what we are able to expect.
Yeah. So Vanessa, I think you're exactly right in pointing to the fact that regardless of, what we might think of as feminist interventions, that's how I like to think about it. Regardless of the feminist interventions that have happened within the adult industry since the early 1970s, feminists opening sex toy stores, feminists making vibrators, feminists making pornography, despite those interventions, I think you're exactly right when you say there's still a dominant perception of what porn is. Like, I'm not quite sure how much the cultural narrative that defines what porn is, who it's for, and how women are positioned within that, I'm not sure that needle has really kind of moved that much. I think you're correct in there. And I don't necessarily think it's a question, if I can flip the question a little bit, so much what can the industry do? What can the industry, or what should the industry do to shift those perspectives? I think one of the biggest things that that we can do to kind of in a positive way to kind of maybe just, shift the needle a little bit goes back to sex education, but specifically goes back to porn literacy. I think that there have definitely been things written about the need for porn literacy, porn education, in a kind of media literacy framework. And media literacy is really all about teaching young people to understand how media works, right? That it's produced, that it's created, and that we can kind of deconstruct messages. But it's all about things like, if we're talking about, mainstream media, understanding in the context of the US, the degree to which capitalism and advertising really informs what we see, right? Because if it's too fringe, you're not going to get the funding or the advertisers that you need, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there really is a case to be made, and I know there's people out there doing this work, that young people, obviously can benefit from better sex education, but part of that better sex education isn't ignoring their interest in porn, isn't ignoring that curiosity, isn't pretending that they're not clicking on Pornhub, but it's kind of educating them about how to make sense of what they're seeing, right? How to kind of teach young people that this is a performance, right? These, in many cases, I know there's amateurs that perform in porn, but professionals are like sexual athletes. They know what they're doing. They know, how to use things like lube for certain, and that, kind of good porn can model kind of sexual communication. It can model consent. I'm not saying all porn does by any stretch of the imagination, but I just think that this kind of porn is bad, end of story, means that young people have this vacuum around this thing that is part of popular culture and part of their world, and they don't then have the skills to kind of understand what it is and make sense of it and interpret it, and they don't have the skills to be able to ask questions like, what is the history of Pornhub, and why is this porn free, and where, under what conditions was it made, and if I'm not paying for porn, what does that mean about the person who's performing? Did they get paid at all? Those are questions that good that's part of ethical porn consumption. So I'm not convinced that it's necessarily, trust me, the industry has long kind of tried to shift popular opinions around the industry, but it's been an uphill battle. And I think, that kind of the it would be great to see, just an increased attention in society given to comprehensive, accurate, medically based sex education, in which porn is part of that, But I think even people hear that question or hear that description, porn literacy, and even that freaks them out. What? What? You're, they don't understand what it means. And so it's just so hard to not provoke knee-jerk responses just by inserting porn into something, right? Because it's so loaded. It's so loaded. And when you have something that has decades of meaning and taps into people's religious beliefs and moral beliefs and feminist beliefs, it's so hard to intervene. There's ways to intervene, but it is challenging, and the work is ongoing. And I guess to go back to this article, that I mentioned at the top of this podcast, that I do not. This was one of the rare occasions where I kind of took a fellow academic to task in written form. It's not something I typically do, but to me, it was part of that intervention. That's a perfect example of, I don't have to respond to this, but if I don't respond to this, then Gail Dines' perception of the 2011 AVN Expo and her perception of this event, this seminar panel that I organized is completely wrong. And I'm not going to let that stand. I'm going to disrupt this discourse and kind of, break it down a little bit and intervene into this top-down argument in a way that might complicate somebody's kind of understanding or perception. So, I think even that article is an example of kind of hoping to expand people's understanding, maybe even their porn literacy.
As we're drawing to a close in these last few minutes, I just two last questions. The first one will be, in your opinion, again, over a decade since you wrote this article, what will be the most frequent misconceptions that you've noticed about porn nowadays?
Sure.
Have they changed even with your students? And the last one, and I hope the listeners will be as curious as me as, did you ever meet Gail Dines? Did you ever confront her? Was there like a cat fight or something?
No. I mean, I've certainly met Gail Dines. We've been in professional settings together. We've had, cordial, albeit kind of maybe guarded conversations around each other, but no, nothing at all resembling anything kind of unprofessional or catfighty at all. We have certainly danced around each other in the work that we do, and kind of, and certainly met in different contexts. But perfectly civil, completely civil. I think the perceptions of porn, I think the one thing that we can say that has kind of remained somewhat constant among a certain segment of, the US public, but not only in the United States, but I'll talk about the US since I'm based here, is this idea that pornography is a problem and that somehow we need to combat this problem, whether through protests or whether through policy, right? But the way in which that problem has been conceptualized and discussed has certainly shifted over time, right? Pornography is a sin. And then feminists came along and said, whoa, pornography is misogynistic and harmful and dangerous. And then, this has morphed in recent years to porn as a public health crisis. A number of US states have kind of passed, measures declaring porn as a public health crisis, and pornography gets blamed for divorce, even though divorce rates have fallen. Pornography has been blamed for male sexual dysfunction. I am no MD, but I'm going to bet that erectile dysfunction has existed long before internet pornography, right? So the kind of framing of the problem of porn as a public health crisis. And I think in more recent years, we're really seeing the conflation between pornography, consensual pornography and consensual sex work being conflated with trafficking. So I think that's the moment that we're in right now, where we're seeing a lot of policy interventions. The 2018 FOSTA-SESTA law that was passed by Congress, signed into law by Donald Trump, has had far-reaching, effects for sexual content online. So I think that the perceptions of the arguments around kind of pornographies as a problem have changed. But I think it's been, certainly there's still, an impression held by a large number of people from different walks of life that pornography is a problem, that it's bad, that it's a public health crisis, that it's akin to trafficking, that it's harmful, all those things. Yeah, so I think, again, that's still a dominant perception.
Right. No, that's true. And like sometimes I can be moderately online. And so there's when you talk about like porn maybe affecting like, male sexual dysfunction and things like that, and like you hear like so and so is a porn-addled brain, and they're no longer attracted to like real women, and so because they're just like consumed by porn and etc. And it's like, okay, I mean, I don't know if that's all true. I think that we're experiencing a crisis in like human romantic interactions, and there's a lot of discourse going on online, and a lot of like rivalry that's kind of like to get clicks, and controversies, kind of like manufactured controversies to get clicks and to get people talking. And then and I'm so glad you mentioned something like Sesta Fosta, and the how it is being treated like this. We're seeing, I'm worried about this kind of like backlash or like turn to this kind of like religious conservative streak that has always existed in the United States, to be honest. It's part of like the foundation of this country. And you see this, like it's treated like a public health, and everything is conflated to human trafficking, and everybody and protect the children and etc. But at the same time, it's like, well, but wait a minute, like we have to separate these things. And people who are being trafficked, people who are being hurt, people who are being assaulted, of course we have to protect, and we have to create conditions where that isn't possible. And at the same time, one should be able to go and have sexual agency and have fun and bring back that joy that is sexuality, and get rid of that shame that is still very much attached to it. And so that's kind of like a reflection or a response to your response. And we have unfortunately run out of time, but I really could talk about, especially with someone like you, could talk about this topic for a really long time. And I have I used to go to a lot of comic conventions, and one book that I thought is great, and I actually have it, because I used to be afraid of like sex toys, and I don't personally use a lot of them. But there is one, it's like a comic book for adults called Ojo, a Sex Toy by Erica Moen.
Oh, yeah.
It's so
I'm
fun.
familiar with
And
them. Yeah.
and it's like it's very inclusive, and includes all types of bodies and all types of sexualities and ways to use these toys. And it's kind of a I would recommend it as a good way to start, like, okay, well, what's going on there, and like what could I like. And so I wanted to ask you if you have some recommendations to even, if you yourself, as me, as a porn skeptic, like how to what kind of things, what could I consume, or what could I read or listen to or watch in order to kind of break that and start bringing back the joy to the sexuality and porn.
I think your recommendation of Erica, is it Moen? Those books, Moen, I believe is how she's.
That's right.
They spell their name, and I think there's a couple different editions of that. So I mean it's comic, it's really well done, informative. I mean, in terms of people, maybe interested. So I'm like looking around my desk. So I would recommend the Feminist porn book, which the Feminist porn book, The Politics of Producing Pleasure. This is not planted. It was just kind of on my desk because I'm writing about something else and I needed to look something up. But what I really like about this book is that it's a collection of essays by academic researchers, but also women and queer folks who've kind of either directed or performed in feminist and queer porn. So I really like the mashup of kind of researchers and then people like on the ground who've been part of like running a company, producing porn, being in porn, and they really engage with these questions that we've been talking about today. Is porn oppressive or liberatory? You know, and it's really helpful, I think, to hear from people in the industry, right? So I think that's a really, and they're short, they're really accessible. It's a great collection. And, I mean, I don't know. If people are interested in the history of feminist sex toy stores, they can certainly pick up my book, Vibrator Nation, which really does a deep dive into businesses like Good Vibrations, Babeland, Early to Bed in Chicago, Self-Serve in Albuquerque, and kind of touches upon a lot of that history about how these businesses really grew out of second wave feminism in the 1970s. And so I think that could maybe just expand people's ideas about the kind of lineage of the term sex positive feminism, and, give people an opportunity to see that the 1970s wasn't only dominated by anti-pornography feminists, right? They got a lot of play. They were on the Phil Donahue show. They were written about in the New York Times, but there were other people doing other kinds of work. So those are two that come to mind, but there's definitely, a lot of my kind of research books are not my university office, but at home. Mm-hmm. But I would recommend Murray Miller Young's book, A Taste for Black Sugar, which is about the experience of Black women in pornography, and that really kind of again, kind of challenges a lot of stereotypes around kind of gender violence and racism, because she did such historical and in-depth interviews with Black women in the porn industry. There's more and more like really great academic work coming out about the adult industry. Heather Berg's book, Porn Work, which again is about the labor of porn, ethnographic, interview-based. Yeah, I could go on and on, but there's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much. And Dr. Comella's book, once again, is Vibrator Nation: How Feminist Sex Toy Stores Change the Business of Pleasure. I'm going to go and pick that up too, because I think that sounds super interesting and fun to kind of delve into that history. So where can we find you? Where can people find you and follow you? And, if you want to mention anything else that you're working on.
My Instagram is mostly like hats and gluten-free baking. So I don't know if that's going to really appeal to folks, but they can find me, my first name and my last name, on Instagram. I am on Threads, but that's mostly me ranting about, kind of 2024 politics. So that's just going to feel like very redundant after a while with my retweets. And I am completely off of Twitter because I made a decision to not support Elon Musk's whatever's happening over there. So I once upon a time had an active Twitter following, but I just needed to let go of it for my peace.
You're brave. You're brave. I cannot do it, but you're brave.
No, I'm not on it anymore. No, I took my I deactivated my account like a year and a half ago.
Wow.
Peace out, Elon.
Yeah.
I can't do this mess that's happening over here. So so I'm not on Twitter anymore. I'm on Threads a bit. Yeah. So
okay, no, great. Very good. Well, thank you so much once again for being here today and for providing us with your time and your wisdom on all of these. And so thank you everyone for listening today. Jorge, you want to say a few more words, or that's just...
Thank you very much for everybody. I'm sure 100% they will love this conversation. It's been really enlightening and fantastic. And as you can see, I think Lynn is charming, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been a lot of fun. I enjoyed talking with you both.
Thank you so much. Everyone, you all can find us at at Contraelite1. We are still on Twitter/X. We are on Facebook and also on Instagram. And you can find us on most of the platforms that host podcast. So Contraelite or at Contraelite1. Gracias a todos los podescuchas y nos vemos a la próxima. Goodbye.
Gracias por escuchar Contraélite. Síguenos en nuestras redes sociales, por Twitter o Instagram, @Contraélite1.